This is the kind of work I think Milton Glaser is even more famous for, just to remind you, put it in your minds as he comes to the stage. And here are some examples of his recent work. I've asked Milton to reflect on the role of criticism in relation to artistic and design practice. As anyone who's heard Milton speak before knows, I could have asked him to reflect on the role of paper napkins, and it would still be spellbinding. But he is really nicely positioned, I think, to comment on the sphere of activity that concerns this department. As one of the nation's foremost artists, designers, illustrators, and educators, I've always admired the way Milton considered his work within a really truly broad spectrum of cultural activity and within a humanistic conception of what it is to be a designer. He pushes his students with hard questions, questioning things, for example, such as the way professionalism is interpreted, which is often to the exclusion of ethics, and makes them consider such quandaries as these, that not a very good reproduction, but these are Milton's ideas of the 12 steps to hell. As a designer, and you know you're in hell if you think designing an ad for a product whose frequent use could result in the user's death. And apparently some students aren't that concerned by that, so he's still got his work to do. Milton co-founded New York Magazine and was its food critic for a while, which is why I suspect he may have been the inspiration for Anton Ego, the acerbic food critic in the movie Ratatouille. Sorry, Milton. It is with immense pleasure that I give you the artist, designer, author, educator, maybe critic, Mr. Milton Glaser.
Thank you, Rose. I'm always interested in the fact that the term artist and designer are used with a sense of distinction between the two activities without actually having a very clear idea about what distinguishes the difference between them. It is so rarely talked about, and I have found during my life that when you attempt to isolate those distinctions, you find that nobody has a very clear idea of what they are, particularly because design can occasionally fall into the realm of art, and very frequently art falls out of the realm of art. And for myself, I've been always trying to reconcile the two activities. For me, the most interesting aspect is how, when designing something that is purposeful, you can integrate the idea of art into it so that the experience that someone has is not merely a response to a functional objective, but rather something quite different, which I finally have isolated as a response to beauty, which I think is really the secret of art, that there is no such thing as art. There's only a response to an even greater mystery, which is our response to beauty. We know there is such a thing because the brain produces a certain kind of activity, a neurological system in response to this, by doing something that it doesn't do when beauty isn't present, and that is actually measurable. And my question has always been to myself is, can you really design something and have these neurons respond as though beauty is in the house? My first notion of being an artist came about when my cousin Eddie was taking care of me as a babysitter. When I was 5 years old, my parents were going out to a dinner. And he came into the house with a paper bag. And he said, "Do you want to see a bird?" And I thought he had a bird in the bag. It was one of those brown paper bags. And I said, "Yes." And he reached into the bag and he pulled out a pencil. And he drew a bird on the side of the bag. And he had some drawing skill, and the bird actually looked like a bird instead of one of these rudimentary drawings that a kid would make. He was 15 or 16 years old, and I remember watching him draw, and suddenly this bird appeared, and it was recognizable, and I almost fainted. It was like receiving the stigmata. It was a true miracle to me. And in my last book, which is called In Search of the Miraculous, or One Thing Leads to Another, it was an experience of the miraculous. And at that moment, I was 5, I decided that was my life. That is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. It was an instant conversion. And that's what I did. I immediately became the class artist. I don't know how many of you have had an experience like that, because as you know, being an artist is a self-anointing process. You declare, "I am an artist." That's all you need. You don't need any approval or validation or anything else. All you have to do is testify. "I'm an artist." Nobody has to check you out. Great privilege. There's no test you have to take. And I became the class artist immediately. And so in kindergarten, when there was an artistic assignment, I got it, just because I had testified to the fact that that was me. I don't remember if there were any other artists in the class, but it seems to me I occupied all the space. That also gave me the responsibility of performing for my fellow students if they wanted a job done. For instance, mostly it was drawing for the boys pictures of young women doing unspeakable sexual things. And they would say, "Make a girl, make her fatter, and make her doing this and this," to which I would. It was my first commercial work. And I was terribly good at it. But even then, I recognized that some of those drawings, though they pleased the client, were not as satisfying to me as others. And even then I recognized there was a question of beauty involved. Some of them were more meaningful to me. But in those days, I had already become an applied artist with a service to offer. And then I went on to junior high school. And in junior high school, I was always very good in science, as well as being the class artist. And I had a wonderful science teacher who encouraged me to become a serious scientist. And he wanted me very much to go to Bronx Science, which is a wonderful school here in New York, one of the great high schools in the city. And I was torn because I wanted to go to High School of Music and Art. And the morning of the examination for the High School of Music and Art entry examinations and Bronx Science, I had to make a decision. And I decided at that time to go to take the exam for music and art, which I did. And I took the exam, and the following day I was walking through the hall, and I saw my science teacher. I tried to avoid him by going to the other side of the hall, but he saw me and he said, and I said, "Uh-oh, the jig is up." He said, "Come into my room." I came in. He said, "Sit down." I sat down. He looked at me, he said, "I hear you took the test for music and art. I said, yes. I was terribly embarrassed. And he leaned over to his desk, he opened the drawer, and he reached in and he pulled out a box of French Conte crayons. You know those crayons with a little bit of chalk in them. And he gave them to me and he said, do good work. I cry when I tell that story. It was like a benediction. After all these years, that blessing, the fact that he cared more about my life than he did about his own desire, was one of the things that changed the direction of my entire life. I still have that box of crayons in my drawer, having never used them. But it was one of those events that takes a minute that changes your life forever. Sadly, an event like that can be as negative as it is, in my case, positive. I mean, an event like that can ruin your life just as easily, which is terrifying to think of how fragile we are in terms of our earliest experience. But that was one of the things that shaped and reinforced my decision to pursue the life that I have pursued. I later got a Fulbright and went to Europe and had the good fortune to study with Giorgio Morandi, who was an extraordinary man who was the opposite of my other model for how to behave in life, who was Picasso. I was somehow between Picasso and Morandi. You could not imagine a more contrasting view of an artist's behavior. Picasso provided this idea that as soon as you learned something, you could abandon it. And he was a man who wanted everything in life, all the money, all the women, all the fame, all the accomplishment, everything, and moved relentlessly and willfully towards accomplishing that. The man with the largest ego in the world. And Morandi was a man who wanted to do nothing except sit in his room in a home occupied by his 3 sisters and paint. He was a man who, if you wanted a painting from him, would write your name and address on the back of a canvas, take $100 from you, and years later, when he had finished a small painting, would turn it over, see who it belonged to, and send it to you in the mail. He wanted nothing but to paint these paintings. And a painting that he sold you for $100 might be worth $200,000 now, or perhaps more. He was a man who wanted nothing except to paint his pictures. During the time I studied with him, he never once talked about the nature of painting, but would be glad to talk to you about the good restaurants in Bologna, and did something else. When you were about to plunge your plate into the acid bath, he would always be at your side and say one thing: coraggio, which is the most important thing you could tell anybody about to plunge their plate into the acid. I've been thinking a lot through the years about the nature of art and its purpose, if it has a purpose. And it has a purpose, which is the survival of the species. It has no other purpose. Art does something to us that helps us survive. It makes it possible for us, because of a shared experience of whatever this thing is that we call beauty, it makes it possible for us to live together and prevent the likelihood of our killing each other. It functions, I suppose, like philosophy or religion, but without ideology. Those of us who share something so fundamental that makes us feel that we have a profound relationship to one another. And that's why it's important, that's why it endures. It cannot be used as a device for persuasion or for money. And whenever we do something where we engage it, it provides a kind of commonality, community, and satisfaction that no other activity seems to be able to provide. And for me, at this point in my life, whenever I do anything that ostensibly comes under the heading of my professional life, which is as a designer, that's what I do, that's what I spend my time doing. I'm certainly not a painter. And I feel that I have somehow engaged this aspect of form making that produces an aspect of beauty that makes people feel that they are united in some way in a common sense of being. I feel that I have done something that is my most fundamental and satisfying activity. A few months ago, Donald Brooks, who is a writer for the Times, I'm sure you read him, who very often is far to my right in many of the things that he writes about, but who I admire for his intelligence, wrote about a questionnaire he had written addressed to the elderly, people over 75, asking them what regrets they had about their life. I wish I was 75 at this point. But and they answered in the most extraordinary and heartbreaking way. 50 to 60% of them said, I regret that I spent my life working in a field that I didn't love. And as a consequence, I don't feel that I lived my life. 50 to 60% said they don't feel they lived their life. And how fortunate all of us here today, every single one of us, will never have that feeling. How lucky we are. Thank you.